Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Susan Lindner, your host of the Innovation Storytellers Show. This is the place where we talk about the stories that get big ideas to the finish line, not just the innovation themselves. And so we come here once a week to learn how other innovators around the world have figured out how to tell stories that allow innovation to advance. And hopefully, we get to learn at the feet of the masters as they teach us how they did it. And so I'm really excited to have a fellow ILO member. Shout out to our friends at the Institute for Innovation at Large Organizations. Thank you, Peter Temis, for all you do. I'm really excited to be joined by Niosha Kayhani, who today is going to be talking to us about the innovation that he has worked on both in the public sector and the private sector, and how we get big ideas moving in gargantuan, hulking organizations, especially when we're on the outside looking in. So Niosha is the Director of International Programs and Commercial Products at Cubic. And if you haven't heard of Cubic, you will today. He is the driver of international business development and product development for commercial and dual use applications. He is a chartered engineer with a background across multiple engineering disciplines and the business acumen gained from progressive leadership roles in academics. He brings a very unique perspective to the table and has a multinational life and has lived around the world and can navigate lots of the complexities of global markets, and I'm sure global team members too. They're fun, right? When we don't all speak the same language, come from the same cultures, all good practice for amazing storytelling, as he is driving very successful innovation and growth at Cubic. So, Niosha, thank you so much for joining me.
Susan, great to be on your podcast.
Well, it's nice to just have you in one place, given all your travels around the world. I feel like just trying to connect is you are a person who is always getting things done, whether it's in the United States or abroad. So first off, tell us what Cubic is for folks who are listening and don't know this organization.
So people might not know Cubic, but they would have come across Cubic systems at in some point in their lives. So Cubic, founded over 70 years ago, started here in San Diego, actually, where I currently am. And it's basically split into two business units, two focus areas around transportation and defense. And on the transportation side, you have large payment systems around the world. So take the New Yorks of the world, the Londons, the Sydneys, managing the payment infrastructure from the ticketing machines to the actual tickets themselves and all the payment reconciliation that happens. That's all Cubic systems. And then on the defense side, there's multiple capabilities spanning from live virtual constructive and game-based type training to simulation and C5 ISR systems,
What's
digital
that?
intelligence.
What's a
Oh,
C5 ISR system for those of us who don't have one in our bathrooms? What is
so
that?
let me, yeah. So let me get this right. It's computers control, and we may have to edit this out if I get it wrong, but computer control, counterintelligence, cyber, and something else that I've completely gone blank on.
Cookies. It was cookies.
It was cookies. That's the
So, these are very sophisticated systems, right? But they also allow us to like pay for the subway or what have you, right? It comes all the way from back end systems all the way into the things that consumers are interacting with daily.
Yeah, correct. So whilst we may primarily be an integrator, we do provide direct to consumers, whether it's in the commercial space or in the defense space with warfighters. We provide not just integrated systems that are integrated with other systems, but also directly to consumers and to warfighters. So our systems have to be quite robust in where they're deployed, whether it is in transportation systems or whether it's in remote locations to warfighters.
Yeah. So no easy task, right? Because reliability is an absolute must 100% of the time without fail.
It's non-negotiable.
Non-negotiable. Yeah. So how did you actually get into the innovation space, Neosha? How did you walk into the innovation door?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I necessarily just walked and stumbled upon it, but the story, I suppose, started from a young age. I was always curious and always wanted to push boundaries. Even from a young age, I'm talking before school years, I would always try and find things to invent, to make things. If things were broken, in the house, that was a opportunity for me to try and take that scrap and take the motor of something and the bulb of something else or the electrical circuit of something else and try and put it together and make something. And I suppose that curiosity and wanting to do something stemmed and continued throughout my career. It was always an area of opportunity and interest to me. I was always someone that never liked to take the word no, and we tried this before as an acceptable answer. So I always had in my engineering background, I always had involvement in research and development. Research and development inherently has links towards innovation because you have to research and develop new ideas or new processes, new business models, and try and get those integrated. So whether it's introducing robotics in manufacturing lines, whether it's a new IT system, whether it's a new business model, I've been part of many successful and unsuccessful launches of those types of innovations.
Yeah, so let's dive into a couple of those. Tell us first, because we always want to, we want to hear the negative news first. Tell us about something that you were working on that maybe didn't reach the intended finish line. You were hoping it was going to be a phenomenal success, and yet other things got in the way. What were you working on that kind of met a demise sooner than you might have liked it to?
If I look back in my manufacturing days, one of my goals was to kind of automate the hell out of the thing. We were building fiber optic laser systems, so by no means an easy product to build. It had a lot of touch points. It had a lot of manual processes. Uh, but of course, with a lot of manual processes and intricate work, when you're splicing together fiber optic cables, which are, I don't know, very, 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 very small signal losses, basically results in the laser blowing up. So we're talking
Yikes.
very, very minutia in detail. So that we had clean rooms and then clean rooms inside of clean rooms just to make sure that there would be no dust particles or anything setting on these fibers when we were cleaning them and splicing them together. I wanted to automate a lot of that. And of course, there was a lot of resistance initially, as there would be. A lot of people had seen a lot more, they'd experienced a lot more in the industry that I had when I came in. And I didn't particularly have, the failure mode effects analysis. I started looking at the SPC charts. I started essentially doing my own analysis, regardless of what the history lessons provided were. I think the history lessons were good for me. It's always good to start understanding what happened to date, but not to necessarily use that as a excuse not to revisit it. I think everything requires, after some stage, a revisit after a few years, or depending on the industry you're in, maybe after a few months, it's worth a revisit. So having gone through the processes, I started, it's always been about a data-driven analysis. Ultimately, it's got to come down to what are you saving in terms of process time or process failure rates, which all ultimately leads to cost. And I was able to do that quite successfully, introduced a robotic process into a silicon dispensing capability. And again, I wouldn't say, you asked me about a failure. There were a lot of failures to get to this point. Like a simple example was the silicon that we mixed in-house initially had to be dispensed and then disposed of after a certain time. And I had pushed that capability to the manufacturer, and I said, I want you to do the mixing and I want you to bring it to us pre-mixed because we're going to stick it in a robot and the robot's going to dispense it. Well, by the time it would arrive to us, it would cure and it wouldn't be usable. We couldn't get 24-hour turnaround. So I said, ship it to us in a freezer. So we had to then go, okay, and then it arrived to us and we would be unsure whether it remained at the right temperatures. Again, we're talking laser products here. And then I said, okay, well, let's put a label on it so that we can track the temperature by the time it arrives to our facility. And I think that's become a little bit more ubiquitous now, is having these temperature trackers on items that you're shipping across. So yeah, there were a lot of small failures to get to where we were. And then of course, once the silicon arrived, we noticed that once we stuck it on the robot, the viscosity coming out wasn't correct. So what did we have to do? We had to make a sleeve that was heated at a certain temperature to keep the silicon at a certain temperature when it was being dispensed. So the goal of automating a process in manufacturing ultimately did become successful, but there were so many small failures and iterations that led us to that. But you can only get there if you have this end goal in mind. And even if the end goal didn't result in full automation, there were a lot of wins along the way and a lot of failures to learn from and continue to iterate.
I was watching an interview with Steve Jobs over the weekend where he talked about how having perfect processes is the death of progress, and that the learning that happens in that process is the most valuable part of the innovation cycle. And he equated it to when he was a little kid, he loved having a rock polisher. So he would go and he would pick up rocks that were dirty and what have you, and he would throw them in his rock polisher and they would get all ginned up and turned around. And then they would get, he would take them out and they would be smooth and shiny and beautiful. And he said that great ideas inside of an organization actually require that the team gets roughed up, that we learn from these experiences and go, crap, that was on me. The viscosity wasn't right, the temperature wasn't right, the positioning wasn't right. And each person who takes a piece of responsibility for that process along the way gets a little dinged, but also gets a little smarter, gets a little smoother, gets a little shinier along the way. And it's the learning of the team combined and kind of the friction that happens that also contributes to the next great thing. And that allows the team to be more resilient when they come around the next time to face the next failure. And I found it fascinating, that analogy of how we get kind of shaken up in order to produce something beautiful in the end.
And then organization's question is, how do you take that approach, or how do you take those things that you just mentioned and turn it into a repeatable process that can yield good results repeatedly, time and time again?
Yeah. And how do we build resilient teams that can rebound quickly from going, oh crap, the viscosity is not there. Well, let's just scrap it. We can't
Yep.
get attendant in the timelines that we told the board, or we told the engineering team, or we told the production team, or the
Right.
commercialization team, right? So let's just scrap it. How often does that happen? And then you watch beautiful, smart, shiny people leave the room.
There is too much. I think there's nothing wrong with killing an idea. I think
True.
there's nothing wrong with killing an idea, but I think only when you've had a genuine try at it, not come up against some level of resilience or restraint or constraints and then give up. I think there's a big difference that sometimes people have forgotten about. There is one thing killing ideas, and there's another thing actually trying.
So let's talk about that. How do you know when to stop? How do you know when to persevere?
Good question. Sometimes it does become emotional once you start the path down the innovation cycle. You do become attached to the idea, especially if the idea was born out of something you care about and you believe it might lead to greater things, whether it's in your own career or again, just your belief system that this is the right thing to do. And killing an idea sometimes, at least this is how I've felt in the past. If you're killing an idea, you're also killing my creative process. You perhaps don't believe that what I've conjured up until this point is the right thing, or that my ideas in the future may not get the same type of spotlight. So I think, again, this is just my experience. People may have different reasons as to why it's difficult to kill ideas, but I think there is a personal attachment at times. And then, but by the way, I don't think personal attachment is a bad thing. If you're trying to drive innovation and you have people who treat it as a day job, and not to know anything against day jobs, but if you just treat it as your normal 9 to 5, I don't think you're going to accelerate and be able to grow in that new venture or new idea the way you're expected to. I think you
Mm.
have to have deep passion towards what you're doing, and rightly so, you should be hurt if it gets killed. But there's a difference between getting hurt and accepting that hurt as opposed to being completely against it. And I think there should be some resistance in organizations and between people. Again, back to the same analogy you were giving. If there is no resistance and you give up at the first hurdle, good luck trying to innovate in an organization.
Right. Yeah, you definitely have to have the stomach for the rough and tumble that comes along with it.
Oh, without a doubt. This is sometimes when you're bringing up a new idea, undoubtedly it means that someone else is going to be feeling like what they've come up with in the past may be attacked, or that their department may have to do something additional, or someone else has to do something. Usually people get their backs up when someone comes up with an idea that may have a perceived negative effect on them.
Yeah, right. I mean, the only way we're getting things better is by saying the last thing we did wasn't sufficient to do the job any longer. And
Hmm,
that inherently is going to offend someone who was working on the last thing
that's right.
and got a raise and a promotion for doing it well in its time.
And now you're coming to undo that. But that's the only healthy way of truly growing in an organization.
Yeah. So let's talk about that because, part of the process of innovation storytelling is actually addressing those. So, we always talk on this show about starting with an empathy map of saying, what is the agony that my listener is going to face by adopting the new thing? Right. And what is his or her perceived benefit of still engaging with it anyway? Right. If we can just take a heartbeat and ask ourselves those two questions and just stand beside them, even if we can't stand in their shoes, and say, where is my listener going to begin bleeding from the neck if he or she says yes to the idea? And how can I arrive with the tourniquet?
Well, there's two ways of looking at this. Either you've been empowered in your position and you have C-level backing that what you do is going to be the right thing. That's one side of it. The other side, of course, comes down to what you're so good at, and what you do is about storytelling. You have to, and I wouldn't say manipulate the message or change the message, but the story has to be relevant and it has to hit the right tone depending on where in the organization or outside the organization that you're presenting it to. If you're going up the organization and presenting it, the story is slightly different to when you're trying to perhaps get the team that's working on the idea, or even the departments that are affected by the new idea, and the outside beneficiaries of the idea. It's very rare that the same story gets told between all of these different parties and stakeholders. And if you did, it probably wouldn't resonate. So you have
100%.
to change your story, and you have to have you have to have the story, but you have to have, I suppose, different subplots. You have to have different plots within it, depending on who you're talking to and what resonates with those people.
I couldn't agree with you more. And by the way, if we think any story on innovation has one chapter and one message, we would be kidding ourselves, right? Because people are motivated by different pieces of the story as well. So tell us about something that has worked.
Something that has worked. Let me cast my mind back to. I'm not just thinking, by the way, because there's not been failures all my life. I'm actually just trying to think of a good example that may be relevant and a quick one. So when I was at Google, we had this process for managing invoices for customers that were using the AdWords platform. And it was a very manual process. There used to be, you know, number of cases that would be reported every year. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was maybe close to 1,000, or at least in the high, seven, 800s of cases that would be dealing with these invoice related issues. And actually, I actually thinking back, the number was probably a lot higher. It was in the thousands. And I queried about it. I said, surely we need to automate this. We need to reduce the number of clicks it takes for a user to be able to do this. We need to make this easier on the back end. And the first response was, yeah, I mean, we're all aware of this problem. And I said, have we done anything about it? Oh, the teams looked at it in the past. Like this has been looked at. I said, and what was the outcome? Oh, well, they've got so much to do. This is just another thing. And I said, oh, okay. That didn't satisfy me. An answer like that is never going to satisfy me. So again, similarly to whether it's a robotic arm or a software platform, I performed the same analysis. I went ahead, I collected the data for the past, I think it was maybe up to 7 years. I spoke to a few people from different departments about this problem, got them engaged. And then when I presented the idea, I had I knew some of the stakeholders were already engaged. I knew that I had a data-driven approach, and I'd also proposed a new solution. So I wasn't asking people to necessarily bridge the gap between where we are now in the current state and where we need to get them to work that out. I'd mapped out what we would do in phase one and phase two to be able to bridge that gap. And and again, part of the innovation process, which I think is important, it's again part of the storytelling process, is when you're mapping something out, whether it's a system architecture or a new proposal, whatever it may be, if you have the idea too polished, I think it's difficult for some people to feel like they can add value when they see the polished version of something. So purposely bringing it back to handwritten notes or something which is sketched out so that people feel like they're adding value to something which is work in progress, as opposed to perhaps their perceived notion of, wait, we're changing your final version of something. We don't want to be disrespectful. And also, it doesn't look like I can add anything to this. So I always have this notion of showing something which is work in progress because I feel like it reduces the barrier of discussion and conversation about something to try and improve it. If you show it too polished, I think people have their guard up, or at least they get a mental block to be able to add something valuable to it. So I did that, and that change was successfully implemented. And again, so this is the thing. It wasn't a genius idea by any stretch. It wasn't anything intelligent. It wasn't anything particularly smart about it. Everyone was aware of this problem. Everyone. But no one had driven it. So I think there's very different things when looking at innovation. There's obviously the great ideas, but there's also, do you know how to drive innovation? Do you know how to drive change in an organization? And it's so important that there are certain characteristics that you need to be able to do that. You need to be willing to talk to people. You need to be willing to get some opinions that might differ from yours. You have to put your neck out on the line a little bit. Again, a lot of people are comfortable with what they do and they don't want to challenge the status quo. So it becomes a case of who are you as a character, and are you willing to have those difficult discussions, even if it means, because what was a fear of mine initially when everyone said, yeah, we're aware of it, it's been discussed in the past, is if I bring this up again, someone's going to say, yeah, we've told you, we've discussed this in the past, stop wasting our time. Of course, that could have the likelihood of that happening was probably high. But I went in with an approach of showing the data, mapping out what I thought was the right way of doing it. Again, in a way which was conducive to collaboration. And it resulted in a pretty good product release.
So, and part of that is really collecting other people's opinions as part of this process, right? It's not just what Niosha thinks. It's I've gathered some qualitative data from the folks around me too.
Yeah. There was definitely, I've broken it down to both quantitative and qualitative on this approach. So that's why I like this example, because it's a very simple idea. I wouldn't even call it an idea, but it just shows the steps you have to take, the stories you have to unwind and tell to different stakeholders to make it successful.
Yeah,
And
I think,
again, balancing it with the customer pain point at the central theme of it.
but I really like this story in terms of, I mean, I wonder how many of my listeners have had this intractable problem, something that has been left unsolved, whether intentionally or unintentionally for a good long period of time. And maybe other folks have come up before you and tried to solve it and fix it and failed.
Hmm.
There becomes this real resistance inside of the organization to say, I don't want to touch that. I don't want to go near that thing. That is a suicide pill.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We've heard those stories many times, they always say the last person that touched this, no longer here.
Right. Whether they left on their own accord or whether they were shown the door, right? Which
Yes.
says a lot about the culture of where they are too.
Mhm.
Yeah. So what advice would you offer, Neosha, when you think about the experiences that you've had, right? I mean, you have multiple engineering degrees, right? There are lots of engineers on listening to this program all the time. And sometimes it's the chief innovation officer or somebody outside of the engineering team who says, hey, I need 20% of your team's time in order to try out to build this new prototype, to build this new thing. Find me 2 full-time employees or find me 3 part-time folk who can work with me on this to build it. How do you when that's the case, what do you tell to your engineering compatriots about how to handle these changes?
Yeah, so when I was given the fortunate position to drive innovation across all of Cubic, the CEO at the time entrusted me with that responsibility. I'd previously been on the transportation side. I had meddled a little bit on some of the defense work, but not deep in it by any stretch, and it was all commercial aspects of it. When I took on that role and eventually moved to San Diego, I realized very quickly the different challenges that were ahead of me as going from an innovator to someone that needs to enable innovation and creativity within others. The challenge was very different. It was very easy for me to do what I did on a daily basis, but then to lead an organization which had about 7,000 people at the time, to have a structured innovation process that was repeatable, that could answer to external, internal shareholders was challenging. And then how do you bring that energy to the people on the teams? And again, one of the great things that we were able to do as the innovation team, we were able to, again, with modest budgets and a central function, we were able to do some pretty great things. We were able to ensure that teams were able to collaborate across the organization. And that's, again, not an easy thing to do. And we did that through multiple ways, right? There are of course game-based theory and other aspects that come into it. But ultimately, what we were able to do was we tapped into the few people around the organization to act as the entrepreneurs in residence or the ambassadors or whatever you call them, to be the extended innovation team. So they would be the ones that would not just spread the good word, but they would be the ones that also created energy from within. Then we had myself as the person overseeing the innovation function, and then you had a CEO who was constantly, by our side, ensuring the teams were motivated. And when I say ensuring the teams were motivated, it wasn't carrots and sticks. It was more by taking a genuine interest. And when you have the support from above, when you have the support from within, I think you're going to do pretty great things. The teams, and it's not for everyone, by the way. It's not that every engineer wants to do work that's more forward looking and innovative. Some people are happy with what they do in their normal day-to-day job. Whereas others, when we were setting up Tiger teams to follow a rapid pursuit for 12 weeks, we would give them some money, some resources, and then 12 weeks to come up with their MVP and business case. There were a lot of people that were they were waiting for something like this. This was an opportunity to let their creative spirits flow. This gave them actually a boost of energy from what they were doing. And I had so many managers come back to me after these 12 weeks would finish and say, yeah, they such and such loved this opportunity. Think of it like the energy that gets created at a 2-day conference or a hackathon or events like that. But imagine it lasting for 12 weeks. And people felt so energized going back to their roles and felt like they could be creative and find the next thing to work on in a similar fashion. So I think having these cycles that continue, and I think if you had it continuously, it becomes meaningless. You have to have it with a period where you take some time to take stock, to reflect on what you've done as well. How can you do it better next time? And then regroup. But I think to create that energy, I don't think it's enough coming from above.
So, part of this work of innovation storytelling is to put mechanisms into the story that allow other people to share their experience of the innovation. How have you found that when you've assembled a team, like these tiger teams, even to kind of spread the gospel of innovation internally? How do you do that? How do you get other people talking if it's not just coming from the top down?
So we had a business analyst on the team, and half his role in the end became communications, focused just on innovation. So it was business analysis and then focused more on communication towards the end of it all. And the reason for that was he was taking the stories from these activities, and it didn't have to always be these tiger teams and rapid pursuits, but any activity that was happening, we would be interviewing them and we would be sharing in a way that we felt would be compelling to others to want to participate. So for us, it's all about having an engaged workforce. If no one is wanting to innovate, then what's the point of our department in the first place? If people don't want to be creative and innovative, there's no reason for us to have existed. So taking stories about ideas progressing, ideas failing, hardships, stories, backgrounds, we were taking that and we had bi-weekly digests, we had webinars internally. We would even invite external people to come and speak. We had quarterly newsletters. We became so focused on sharing stories and numbers and figures so that it became more and more accessible to people. That's what one of our goals within the department became quite abundantly clear that we needed was how do we how do we take what we're doing, and not necessarily for the reason of justifying our existence. It was more about how do we do it in a way that it scales to an organization of 7,000 people that are globally dispersed and view innovation in very different ways. We need to take the stories of the individuals. It's one thing me standing on a platform saying it's great to innovate as the director of innovation. It's one thing the CEO saying it, but again, if your peers don't believe it, why would you believe it?
Right. So important. And I loved how this eventually becomes part of the culture, right? If you can actually see the progress, and it only happens by regular and repeated communication. And to my listeners out here, if you haven't made friends with your internal comms person, do it. Take them out to lunch, buy them a sandwich, have a conversation about how to get integrated into the content calendar, how to fill them in on what's going on. You can be a huge lift to the comms team, and an ally in the communication suite is exactly what you need if you want your next innovation to take off. And by the way, if your career, our average chief innovation officer lasts 22 months on the job. So if you want your next innovation to take off, the way to get other people on board is to let them know what's happening before you begin soliciting ideas, and use the internal comms team to help you get there. Now, I'm curious, Niosha, if you would kind of give code names to these projects or give them names so that you could actually develop a brand around some of these innovations that you worked on.
I'll think about it, Susan.
If you haven't done so yet, there are pieces in this process that are good to consider. So, first off, if you're announcing a shift, a change in direction, name the shift. What's happening in the world, and why is it that we need this now? And then next, what's the new era that we're taking people into, and name that. So we can see the station that we began at, what's causing and triggering the need for it, and then our destination station. Where are we headed to? And so
Mhm.
when you can connect the dots for people, they're more apt to get on the train and go with you.
Mhm.
If you're just,
Agree.
saying we're driving off into the future, God knows what's coming next. It could be my career going off a cliff.
Yeah. And that's why I think the short cycles and the reinforcement there is important. And I think one thing that I'd missed in all of this is you need to have sponsorship and buy-in from functional management. I mean, if you're set up in a matrix organization, you've got to have functional management on board. You've got to have you've got to have a general manager type or a business development type usually involved as well. So that's one of the aspects that I drove heavily on is who are going to be the sponsors of this idea. And I don't mean at the end of it as a handover process, but from day zero, do I have the buy-in from the people that will ultimately have to run with this and support it and nurture it once these 12 weeks, as an example, are done? So I wouldn't fund anything at this stage when there wasn't someone from business development who was fully on board and that would put their name on it and a general manager that had supported it. If that wasn't the case, it's not going anywhere.
And
Because ultimately we'll get to the end of the 12 weeks and then it won't go anywhere. So I may as well know at day zero.
that's right. And one other person you might think about getting on board is who is in the greatest pain if it stays the same?
Mhm.
Where's the squeakiest wheel in this process that says, I can't tolerate one more moment of the status quo, right? Unless someone's willing to embrace the problem, they'll never embrace the solution, right?
Mhm.
Or they'll find excuses why. The person who is in desperate need to get the problem solved,
Right.
whatever that incentive may be, super helpful. Well, Neosha, this has been like a very eye-opening conversation, very practical, really like to the right to where the metal meets the road here. What advice would you give to chief innovation officers who are maybe just embarking on this path and thinking about how to do this well? What would you recommend to them? I mean, you're in a multinational organization. You work in the public sector, the private sector, you work in B2G, right? All things, even B2M, I guess that's military, which is a whole other can of worms, right, to manage.
My
You
yeah,
up.
my advice would be you have to you got to build your network, and that's internally and externally. If you've been promoted within, you might already have your network fairly well established. For the chief innovation officers that are coming into a new organization, I would say you got to get the people on board because undoubtedly you are going to be asking for resources that someone else might be wanting to put their name on. That's A, get your resources in order. B is the external resources. So this stems from anything like Peter's organization to multiple different sources of input and being able to drive ideas. So whether it's customer focus groups, whether it's universities, academia, whether it's SMEs, startups, wherever they are in the cycle, I think having a network which isn't just solely internally focused and keeps your eyes wide on the macro as well as the micro, I think is extremely important. Thirdly, within the organization, you have to understand, now that you have your networks, you have to understand how things get done. And of course, you can always challenge that, but you have to understand how things get done from a resource allocation perspective to a costing perspective to IT systems perspective, whatever it is that you might need to run your department successfully, you need to have all those elements in place, or at least an understanding of them, or things are going to become very difficult to progress. And then access, and this goes a little bit back to external, is access to the customers. As an innovation leader, you do want to have access to the customers because those are some of the you want to vet ideas, you want to listen in, you want to understand their workflows and what they're doing to try and bring that back. Again, customers aren't necessarily going to tell you that this is what they need, but by listening and understanding and empathizing with what they're doing, you can map that out and you might be able to extract things that are important. And then lastly, when you're setting up your own department or your own function, having the right people in the central team is critical. whether you have an innovation manager that manages the portfolio and the pipeline, whether you have a business analyst and a communications manager, I think that's extremely important. I think you also need to have, ideally, at the very high level, almost like a systems architect that can also help you or help the teams in the ideation process, looking at from a systems perspective very quickly and advise on feasibility. And then, of course, the extended part of the team, I think you have to have business development, sponsorship. You need to have general management sponsorship because you need to be able to pass ideas on without them dying after you've done your work as the innovation leader, because you're not going to sit with the idea until the end of the product cycle. At some stage, you're going to have to part ways, and you need to make sure that the process continues.
Well said. All right, Niosha, I ask every guest who comes on the show these three questions. So, what do you believe is the greatest innovation of all time?
I think when you asked me this once, I said electricity, and I probably still have to find something, or maybe I said communications. I think it's got to be something so fundamental that without it, nothing else would have possibly occurred. I think an easy answer would have been the internet, but I think even more fundamental than that. I mean, I could go even further back and how we manage fire in the first place. The fire itself, of course, maybe not an invention, but how to manage fire. It's pretty fundamental to how we live as a civilization. And I suppose nothing else would have happened. But communication, I mean, it's so critical in everything we do. It did enable the internet. It's enabled us so many great inventions on the back of it.
So, I love what you said about that. It's not just fire, it's fire management,
Mm.
right? Otherwise, you burn down your house. You might not want to do that fire experimentation, right? In your home, in your nice little wooden
Susan?
lean-to. Yeah. Did you get that? So my next question, Neosha, is if you could join any innovation team in human history, which one would you join?
I mean, from having read multiple books, it looks like, well, at least it feels like the old Silicon Valley would have been quite interesting. I don't know how great it would be to work with Shockley semiconductors, but that seemed very groundbreaking at the time. I think that would have been quite interesting at the time. Something so small and to the eye, so perhaps seemingly insignificant, but something so critical to how the whole world and the industrial revolution and everything beyond after that and the digital revolution was able to take advantage of this. So yeah, I wonder if the old Silicon Valley days around there would have been interesting to be part of. Certainly read a lot of stories about different characters, but I guess working alongside people like Andy Grove would have been inspiring.
For sure. Yeah, I just watched a movie called General Magic. It's a documentary on the most exciting technology company of its day, which basically aimed to create what is today's iPhone, but 15 years earlier.
Hmm.
And some of the greatest inventors from Silicon Valley came from that experiment of General Magic that died. Phenomenal, phenomenal film. If you have the chance to watch it,
Oh,
well
it's
worth your
now on my
time.
list. I have
There you
to.
go. 90 minutes well worth spent.
Oh,
And
okay.
you can just find it on YouTube. It's free, and very well produced, by the way. So my last question is, what's something that you wish were invented, something that really pisses you off, or something you just wish existed in the world?
Besides peace and prosperity,
Those are big ones. If you could
and no,
invent a startup around that, that would be great.
yeah, this is a tough question. Something that is, I mean, this is so much about perspective, right? We're so fortunate where we are, where we live, what we have, that talking about what frustrates me and angers me is so insignificant to inventions that or necessities that are otherwise so critical to people in other parts of the world when we're going through areas of world hunger, disease, war. You see that, you know, something that may frustrate me and I want something to be more efficient if I fly from one country to another. These are all real privileges that other people don't even perhaps ever get to experience. So it's a difficult question for me to answer, I suppose, I wouldn't even say in light of recent news, but just continuous suffering happening in different parts of the world. It's a difficult question for me to answer. But if I was to be around decentralized news and facts, perhaps maybe that's something that's linked to it. In with the surge of LLMs, large language models, LLM being on the towards truth is going to be even more critical. An area of frustration for me and many others in the world is always about what are we being fed versus what's actually real. There's been many things happening. It happened at Google, it happened at other places where incorrect information was given by these AI chatbots or large language models. And then you start questioning what is truth at the end of it all. And is it going to become so realistic that we're going to have different narratives on what truth is and how you even define it in the first place? So I think that's going to be a major pain point now and going forward.
Agreed. What is the source of truth that we can all have faith in? Media studies are telling us now there are 12 individual media bubbles currently in the United States that appear to be impenetrable from one to the next, meaning we don't believe what we're hearing in the other bubbles.
Mm,
So,
incredible. 12 versions of one
of
piece of
one
truth.
truth. That's right.
Imagine that.
Yeah. And so that's why campaigns now are in the billions of dollars of spend, right? Is we're just trying to penetrate with a truth. And I'm not going to say who holds which. Neosha, tell us where people can get in touch with you if they want to learn more about your work and connect.
Well, either through you, Susan, I suppose they can they can contact you. No, but I'm available on LinkedIn as well. So you'll be able to find me.
Fantastic. Neosha, thank you so much for joining me today. And we
Pleasure.
look forward to more of the amazing work coming out of Cubic. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.